Welcome to our summary lecture. My name is Kelly Zheng,
I'm Sharan Sawlani.
and we're going to talk about summary today. The first half of the lecture will be like kind of intro to summary, like the basics, and then the second half of it will go into some more advanced stuff, but obviously all of this is applicable to everyone, so feel free to watch the whole thing. Okay. So starting off, we're going to talk about the third minute just because it's really new in PF and there's a lot of misconceptions floating around. So my first misconception is that people think that we should go for more arguments in summary because there's a third minute. But no, functionally, the summary is still the same thing, just with more time. So you should still be collapsing and condensing your arguments. You should not be going for everything. The second misconception is that the minutes should now all be weighing, but realistically speaking, you should have been weighing with 2 minutes. But the nice thing about the third minute in summary is that you actually have time to adequately do it. So you should be weighing in summary. The third misconception that I've heard is that it makes Final Focus harder because summary is longer. But realistically speaking, Final Focus actually gets a lot easier because there's a lot less rebuilding to do and there's a lot less need to clarify after summary. And also, weighing is now developed in summary. So it becomes a lot easier for weighing and Final Focus to actually be fleshed out and like fully warranted. So in that manner, Final Focus gets a lot easier. The fourth misconception is that you don't need to rebuild in second rebuttal now that you have a third minute in summary, but you should really still be frontlining in second rebuttal. If you don't, like, I think that like A, it's like abusive in some manners, but also B, it makes your summary a lot harder because like obviously now you have to frontline a lot more and there's just not enough time for you in summary, so you should still be rebuilding in second rebuttal. And then the last misconception is that first summary still doesn't need defense, and I think that based upon like the general consensus, I think that now most people are requiring defense to be in first summary just because there is more time. Like I think that like in the past, the justification was that there was not enough time, but now that there's a third minute, you should be able to extend defense and things like that. So those are the main misconceptions about the third minute. But like overall, basically the message is that summary is still functionally the same thing. It's just that you have a third minute to do more explaining and implicating of arguments and weighing. So summary should be a lot better now.
So now we're going to talk about the intro to summary, and we're going to talk about extending arguments, how to pick what arguments to go for, how to collapse, and really what your summary should look like in terms of structure. So the first thing is, what is a summary and what is the purpose of it? And essentially what it is that it sets up the final focus by crystallizing the debate. So at this point in the debate, there's been around 4, 8, 16, around 20 minutes of speaking, probably a little more. And your job as the first speaker is to condense it into the round and set your partner up in the final focus. And that's why you're often going to see the better teams on the circuit and around the country where the summary and final focus mirror each other in the sense that they both sound pretty similar. The summary also functions as a way for you to rebuild case or frontline, which means responding to responses that were made in the rebuttal before you. You can extend defense, which are responses on their case, and extend offense off of your case and your opponent's case. The bare minimum in summary, what you should be doing, even if you respond to 0 defense, you should be responding to offense, which is reasons why the judge should vote for you as opposed to why they should not vote for your opponents. And it helps you develop a clear narrative, and it really just sets you up and writes your judge's ballot from earlier on in the round. So the way you should be extending arguments, the way we like to call it, is through this new acronym. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to name the argument. So what you're going to do first, you're going to signpost, which is you're going to tell your judge where you are on the flow and briefly summarize the argument. Then you're going to explain it, which means you're going to, for example, explain this evidence that says this, and then you're going to explain what the argument says. Then, if your opponent's made a response to it, you're going to respond to that response so that there is no ink or response onto it as you're extending it. And finally, you're going to weigh the response. You're going to tell the judge why it matters in terms of the round and why it's sufficient to win you the round. The next important thing is going to be frontlining. So I talked about it a little bit a couple slides ago, where your opponents are going to be making responses to your case in the rebuttal speech. And there's a couple of things you should know in terms of frontlining. The first thing, you should be prioritizing turns. This is really important because they're really dangerous to ignore. And the reason this is true is because you don't want to give your opponents offense on your case because it just gives them another avenue to the ballot. Another thing that you should look for when you're frontlining is you should be grouping similar responses. A lot of time what happens is that your opponents are going to make 5 responses and 3 of them are going to have the exact same underlying link into the argument they're making. At that point, you should be like group their first, second, and fourth response that essentially all say the same thing. And so instead of responding to each of them one by one, you knock all 3 of them out at the same time. Then you should look to see if your case answers any of the responses. And this doesn't mean that like rereading your arguments and saying that responds, but moreover saying that don't buy their response because this specific evidence we read in case responds to it and explain why instead of just rereading it. I wouldn't read more than one frontline per your opponent's response, but I would spend more time on it if like it was like a 40-second response they made. And finally, you need to explain why your frontline is true, and this includes interactive analysis. And what this means is that, like I was saying before, don't just repeat what your case says. Actually interact with your opponent's responses and take into account and actually explain why your case or why your frontline responds to what they're trying to read. A pretty easy structure is my opponent's argument is wrong, my argument is true, and this is why this is important, and this is why it matters.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about choosing arguments to extend. So this is like issue selection. So we think that there's like 3 different levels that you can look at in terms of deciding four, I should say 4 different levels that you can look on to see which arguments you should be extending in summary. So the first of which is that impacts that easily outweigh your opponent's case. So we're going to talk about weighing a little bit later. But for instance, if they're reading a case that only impacts to one country and your case impacts to the entire world, then obviously in this manner you should be going for the contention that easily outweighs their contention about impacting one country. The second one is that you want to take the path of least resistance. So this is the argument that has the least number of responses, or just like a number of responses that are not very good. So kind of like what Sharan was saying earlier, if you can group all their responses because they have the same underlying logic about like economic growth being good, and you can respond to them in like 30 seconds, and this is probably an argument that you want to go for, which is basically what the third thing is. And then the fourth thing is arguments that link into one impact. So if you and your opponent are basically like are both running multiple contentions, but one of each of your contentions links into climate change, then it's a lot easier to do some sort of like link level analysis on climate change as opposed to trying to weigh like climate change versus war, because at this point, like climate change and war are like both pretty bad impacts, obviously. So it's like kind of annoying to have to do some sort of impact analysis on it. So we think that you should be probably comparing links and which team has a better link or like reason for why like affirming or negating does or does not trigger climate change. But that being said, obviously you go into a tournament kind of with like a what's the word? Never mind. With like an idea of what you want to extend in each round. However, you obviously want to be comfortable adapting your strategy to each round. Like there will be rounds where your strategy won't work and you'll have to like change mid-round, which is totally okay. You just need to be prepared for that. So pre-tournament, think of all the different ways that you can possibly win your case or want to find different paths to the ballot. Move on to okay. Oh, this is you. Sorry.
Yeah. So what a lot of younger debaters do is they think they need to go for every single argument on the flow. And what's really important in winning rounds is collapsing. And basically what this means is that instead of going for all 3 of your contentions, you go for one and just spend a lot of time on it. And that's really strategic in summary because it gives you more time to focus on what your arguments are instead of spreading yourself too thin. This focuses around on what your side believes to be the biggest issue, and it allows you to weigh the argument instead of weighing 3 separate arguments. In terms of summary and how your summary should look, there isn't really a set structure that is successful, but here are a couple of suggestions that we found to be strategic in our careers. So the first thing, you would start off on framework, and then you would extend turns on their case. Then you would frontline turns on your case. Then you would extend your arguments in your case, and then you would weigh them. I personally did this in my career, and I found it to be pretty useful. But I know the second one, which is start on your case, then weigh, then go on to their case while extending turns, was also pretty useful.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about ways to prepare for summary. So I think that before the round, a lot of preparation has to occur. So obviously we should be thinking about front lines. So that's basically talking with your second speaker or just like your team about general responses or common responses to the argument you're reading and finding specific pieces of evidence to frontline it. That being said, always think about how your case can frontline because obviously you will know your case better and it's much easier to use in-case evidence as front lines. Then before a round, you should also be thinking about which arguments to go for before the tournament because this is important because you have to think about which pieces of evidence are actually necessary because you're never going to be extending all the pieces of evidence within a contention. So obviously, you need to sit down with your partner and think about which pieces are evidence which pieces of evidence are necessary for us to win this argument. This makes it much easier to condense and collapse later in the round because you're not like before someone being like, oh my gosh, like there's 30 pieces of evidence, like I need to extend 5. Um, then in terms of in-round preparation, I think that since summary is basically like the first speech in the second half, it sets up everything your second speaker will say in final focus. So with that in mind, I think that it's really important to take the most prep time before summary because you really need to work with your second speaker on which arguments you're going to go for, like weighing analysis, like all those things. Because if you don't say them in summary, your partner can't say them in final focus. And then the third thing is making sure your partner or you and your partner are on the same page. So this is like a little bit before the round, but also like during the round. So before the round, obviously you guys should have a common strategy. During the round, you should be like, hey, I'm going to do this, 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 and this, even if it is your strategy, because sometimes your partner is on a different page. So as Sharan said earlier, being able to mirror summary and final focus is really important because the content should be very similar. And in that manner, it's also familiar to the judge. So it's easier to want to vote off of it. And generally speaking, like as I said before, summary is like super, super important because it sets up everything your partner will say in the second half of the round. And like in that manner, a lot of people will say it's like the most important speech in the round because it really will decide what happens later. Okay. And next we'll talk a little bit about weighing and summary and why we should do it. So the first reason is that summary sets up the path to the ballot. And what this means is that, like, as I said before, summary is starting at the second half of the round and laying out the reasons why the judge should begin to think about why they should vote for you. Um, so in terms of weighing, this is really important because it does direct comparison between both sides of the flow. Because up until now, most of the round is just kind of like you attacking your opponents and your opponents attacking you on different sides of the flow. I think that summary and weighing really brings that together and like does direct comparison between why the judge should prefer you over your opponent. Then in terms of weighing, like you probably have heard a lot of buzzwords. So examples of this are like probability, like magnitude, scope. I recommend that people, especially those who are just beginning to debate, should avoid these terms because a lot of the time people will substitute these terms for actually doing the weighing. So they'll just go, we outweigh on scope, and they'll move on and not actually explain how they outweigh on scope. And that's really harmful for you because you're not actually doing weighing and you're just wasting time in your summary. Um, then weighing and summary is really important because it sets up weighing for your second speaker to develop further in final focus. And a lot of analysis, since the summary is now 3 minutes, should be in summary and not just be created in final focus. Um, and then I'll talk about types of weighing. So the first type of weighing, which I think is the best, is comparative weighing. So what I mean by this is like kind of weighing your arguments in the context of your opponent's arguments. And what that means is, for instance, if their argument is like, or if your argument is a recession and their argument is climate change, you say that a recession is more, or prioritizing stopping a recession is more important than climate change policies, because if a recession occurs, then countries can't spend money on like green technology and also have the ability to prioritize the environment over the economy because they need to increase economic growth and stimulate the economy. So this is essentially talking about my argument in the context of theirs, which does direct comparison for the judge between which argument is more important. And this is really great analysis to always do in a round. So before the round, when you are prepping with your partner and on different types of weighing, definitely think about how your impacts directly compare with other impacts. And the second one is obviously like this is kind of more for lay rounds, but stress how your impact relates to other, like people's lives. So I think that this is really effective in lay rounds because it really gives your argument a more definite impact, and it also is able to like outweigh weird and confusing arguments. So like if their argument is like, I don't know, like the extinction of like subseabed like whatever creature things, and your impact is about climate change, kind of like on a more broad level, then obviously like climate change is much more relatable to like Bob the judge as opposed to like subseabed species. I don't even know if that's a thing. Like subseabed species going extinct. So this is really useful for lay rounds, but also in like flow rounds where like their argument is very abstract and you don't really understand what it looks like. And then when your impacts are the same, so if you guys are both linking into climate change, uh, you should be weighing warrants. So this is kind of what we talked about earlier about link weighing. This is basically stressing why your story is more believable as to why your argument is more likely to trigger the effects of climate change or stop the effects of climate change than theirs. And these are basically asking yourself, why is my link chain more probable? Why is my link chain more believable? Things like that. And then Sharan will talk about how to implement weighing.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things you can do. And the first thing is type of weighing before the tournaments. And what this means is that in your block file, you can write, for example, on climate change, and you just write out how climate change outweighs a bunch of different arguments you think people are going to be reading at the tournaments. And pre-writing this weighing will probably help you and save you some time in the round because you already know what you're going to say, and it allows for you to practice it before, so you're kind of not just coming up with stuff on the spot. And the second thing you should be doing is starting weighing early in the round. In Crossfire, target your questions to be about like impact comparisons. So for example, like what Kelly was saying a little earlier, was asking questions like, can you solve for climate change without with a recession going on? And usually they're going to say probably no, or even if they say yes, you're going to say no the next speech anyway. But regardless, setting yourself up in Crossfire for this type of weighing will perceptually make you look better in the round, and will also probably give you some more weight later on. Second thing is reading weighing overviews. This is more of a thing that we've seen happen in the rebuttal speech now, but making it simpler in summary, so explaining it in less time in summary, is also super important, and you should definitely start practicing how to do that. A way you can do that is before the tournament, you should have your partner read the overview they're going to read, and then you just extend it, but in a shorter way. The third thing you could do is explain why your responses are important. So if you're reading defense, you can read it, and then with the analysis you give after, make it an offensive argument by weighing it and explaining why that actually matters in the context of the round. Then you can weigh directly after extending your arguments, which, like we said earlier in the structure and basically in pretty much every slide we've said before, when you're going back to your case at the end, you should definitely be using that last minute or 1 minute of your 3 minutes weighing and explaining why your arguments outweigh your opponent's arguments. And then fifth, you should practice weighing in each round you do. If you don't do it in a round, make sure you're giving redos after every round and practice weighing. Then it'll only help you get better, and the most successful debaters weigh in every round. So now we're going to talk about what you should not be doing in summary. And the first thing, like we've talked about a couple of times, is don't go for every argument on the flow. If you do this, you won't have any time to explain every argument you have in depth while also weighing and frontlining. So basically what's going to happen is you're going to spread yourself too thin, and the judge isn't going to have anything substantive to vote off of. The second thing is don't not extend things. And what this means is don't just say our argument is about climate change and then move on. Make sure you're extending specific pieces of evidence on each level. So that means, relating to the third thing, extend your warrants, extend your impacts, because you won't have a link to your argument without extending those in your summary. Make sure when you're extending evidence. So, for example, if you're extending a specific piece of evidence and it's from Johnson, make sure Johnson says this is the warrant, and the impact comes from, I don't know, Kelly, and Kelly says this. Make sure you're not ignoring important responses your opponents make. A lot of time this is turns. If you drop a turn, a lot of time what's going to happen is your opponent's going to come up in the final focus or even the second summary and just blow it up. And that's usually going to be the reason you lose the round. So make sure you're responding to important responses and overviews and turns and stuff like that.
Okay, so now we're gonna go over some drills that you can do to improve summary. So I think the first, obviously practice rounds are definitely the most important way to improve on summary because you have to like, like it'll actually give you like the experience of doing summary in round. But that being said, there's obviously other things you can do. I think the first one is that you can watch rounds, you can give the summary, let's just say give, and then you can, oh my God, and then you can watch the summary after. I think this is a really great drill because like there is kind of a model for like what you should be doing in the round most of the time. Usually these sort of rounds like are on YouTube, so it's pretty easy to find. I'd highly recommend doing that. The other thing that I think is a really great exercise to do with your partner, or you can do this on your own technically, is read a case. Your opponent will, so read an AF, and then your opponent will read a logical rebuttal to the neg, so that helps them practice their analytics. And then you will practice frontlining the case. So that'll usually be around 2 minutes. It'll be frontlining the case, but also extending case. And then for a minute, you can do the summary on the other side that practices extending defense from your partner's logical rebuttal. So this is really great for practicing frontlining and also practicing how to extend arguments, but also for your partner to do analytics. So this is definitely one of my favorite drills to do. And then in terms of weighing, obviously, this should say impact/link weighing round. So this is just like where you do a condensed round of only weighing. So like cut speech, do like a regular PDF round, but cut the speeches in half. And you just compare different impacts and different links to impacts. I think that this idea is taken from Ruby March, so shout out to Ruby. If you're doing a practice round, you can try to concede your entire case and only give weighing responses. This will really force you to actually weigh and make new analysis in each speech because this is the only thing that you can win off of. The last one that I like to do is that I'll have my students give logical rebuttals to a case, but they're only allowed to give one defensive response, and the rest of the speech has to be weighing of links or weighing of impacts depending on what the case is. So these are all really great drills to do, and really like the one way to get better at summary is just to keep practicing it, and also I think that watching summary can be really helpful. Okay, so now we're gonna go over some like more advanced summary stuff. So we're gonna go over structure. We'll talk about extensions, first versus second summary, argument selection, and then also different techniques that people have used for summary.
So we talk about what summary should look like, and a lot of the time we talk about how, well, if depending on the tournament you're going to, it should be a minute 20, 40-second split if they're using 2-minute summary, then 2-minute, 1-minute split if you're doing 3-minute summaries. And essentially what this means, you're spending a minute and 20 seconds on your case and weighing, then 40 seconds on their case, or 2 minutes on your case weighing, a minute on their case. You get it. So it's important to have organization in your summary and make sure you're extending a narrative, and then you're frontlining the responses given to the said narrative, and then extending the specific cards.
Oops, is this me?
Yeah.
Oh, this is me. Okay. So we're gonna talk about extensions and like different strategies for it, because this came up at camp a lot. So a lot of people will say that you should extend while frontlining, and there's obviously a lot of benefits to this. So in terms of that, like you have more efficiency because you don't have to like go back and do a separate extension of your argument. And also like it's beneficial in some ways because it begins to develop like a clearer narrative as opposed to frontlining and then extending separately. I do, however, think that there are some harms of extending while frontlining. So, like, as a judge, like, it is kind of hard to differentiate between what is a frontline and, like, what is a case extension, like, on the flow, because they're, like, ending up in the same place. A lot of the time, too, this lends itself to create incomplete extensions. So what that kind of looks like is kids will just, like, frontline the argument and then be like, and then they'll just kind of move on because they'll forget that they're extending at the same time. So those are two drawbacks from extending while frontlining. So I always recommend that you frontline first and then extend, or extend and then frontline. it's really up to you. It's really personal style and what works for you. I just think that while you're extending and frontlining at the same time, there's like a little bit more thinking that you have to do, obviously, because you have to make sure you have both complete front lines but also complete extensions. So it's really up to you at this point. But these are just like different strategies that we talked about at camp. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about frontlining and how it is not done correctly, and we're gonna like use an iceberg as an example for this. So the top of the iceberg is like what you can see above the water, and this is usually kind of like what people say in most times. So a lot of the times, even in high level rounds, frontlining just becomes like a repetition of case or something that doesn't really interact with the nuance of whatever response is being read. So like I don't know, like I don't have an example, but basically, like people will just like be like, no, that's not true, and they'll move on. That's not a front line. That's not adequate. And then even when the front line is adequate, the implication or the comparative analysis between like the front line versus the response that is being read is not sufficient. So basically, a lot of the time, people don't actually implicate why they are frontlining a response or what their front line means for the round. So that's a lot of the problem. So all of the rest of the iceberg under the water is the stuff that people are kind of like hinting at in the round, but not quite getting at. And this is like all the analysis that needs to be in the round and is not made most of the time. So usually all the stuff under the water is like the right arguments are being made, but they're not being framed correctly or they're not being implicated. Like they're just like arguments that exist on a flow, but they don't interact with the wider context of the round. So a lot of things that exist like kind of under the surface of the water is actually frontlining completely. So like a lot of people will just be like, their argument isn't true, and then they'll move on. But they don't give a reason as to why their frontline is true and like why I should prefer their frontline over their response. Because this like if you do something that's like, oh, like you should prefer this response because blah blah blah. This is direct comparative analysis between their response and your frontline, which is really great for their judge because it allows them to see like, you know, like which one they should prefer. The second one is like doing complete comparative analysis. So I like to call this kind of like the back end of like analysis. So like an example is like you will be like, oh, they don't outweigh on scope. But you have to explain, why do you outweigh on scope? And most kids usually just go, they don't outweigh on scope and they'll move on. But you need to give a reason as to why you are outweighing, or else it's not directly comparative analysis. It's just saying that they don't outweigh. So that's really important because a lot of the time weighing is incomplete in summary because of that. Then the last thing that kind of exists on the surface of the water is that people don't implicate arguments. So like a lot of the time people will make like really good front lines to responses, or they'll like extend the right argument, but they don't explain why they are extending an argument or frontlining an argument in a certain manner, because there's certainly reasons for doing everything, and like internally you know why you are doing something, but that needs to be explained to the judge too, because we're not like thinking about the round from your perspective or winning the round. So I think that a really great like thing to think about while you're giving summary or practicing is like attaching the sentence, this is important because, after you frontline, because that makes you explain why you're spending time on it, or being like, this means that blah blah blah. So these are like two things that you can think about in a round that will really help you implicate arguments beyond the fact that they're arguments that exist. Oh, okay. So then in terms of first versus second summary, there's like a few differences, but like not a ton of differences. So the first thing in first summary is that often you'll be prioritizing front lines because like you're obviously trying to win case given that you don't really know like what second summary is going to go for. But that being said, obviously you still need to like extend defense. So in first summary, you really need to be strategic with defense in the sense of like you need to pick good defense. So well, obviously turns are offense, but you should be extending turns. You should not be extending mitigatory responses because that's just being like, oh, well, their argument like happens, but like it's not as bad, but that's like a silly response. Like there's definitely better defense you should be like extending. So it should be like terminal defense, but also like uniqueness responses. And I think that's really important and something that kids don't really utilize all the time is like looking at argument structure. So like uniqueness, link, internal link, impact, and realizing that their opponent doesn't have like good uniqueness or like an internal link. So these are also really great strategies for summary because it makes it a lot easier for you to like respond to their argument without actually having to think of a new response or using your case to respond. You can literally just be like, they have no uniqueness or the internal link doesn't exist because of blah, blah, blah. That's a lot easier than like, you know, having to think of a new response. The last thing is that obviously you should be weighing in for a summary. Like obviously you don't know what they're going for, But in a lot of high level rounds, like it becomes pretty clear after rebuttal because weighing and rebuttal will start there. So you should be weighing. In second summary, you're prioritizing offense, obviously. So like extension of turns or like things like that in their case, and also like your own case. In second summary, you have to respond to turns. Ideally, these turns should be responded to in like second rebuttal. Like it really should be at this point. And then I think that in second summary, if you have more time, you should be doing more explanation of your arguments versus theirs. And this kind of leads me into like you should be weighing. There should be a lot of weighing done in second summary. And it should be very good weighing because you know what the first summary went for. So you can do direct comparative analysis.
So now we're talking about how you should choose what arguments to collapse on. And there's a couple of right answers here. And the first is the argument you planned on ahead of the round, before the round. So realistically, when you're writing case, you're going to have one argument that you like more than the others, and that you're going to pre-write weighing for. So if that's the argument that's left for you in the beginning before summary, and you feel you can still win that argument, you should totally just go for it. But if that's not always the case, and usually it isn't always the case, you should go for the path of least resistance on the link level. And what that means is that either A, it's an argument with little to no responses left on it, or B, arguments that fit well under the framework that both teams agreed on. So for example, if you and your opponents agree that climate change is the most important impact in the round, and your arguments are about deforestation, you should just go for that argument and win under the framework as opposed to running your like economic argument. What's really important to do here, especially in like these kinds of arguments when you have similar frameworks, is link weighing. And so when two arguments are clashing with the same impact, you're going to explain to the judge why your link outweighs theirs and why your link should be prioritized and is better linked into the impact, if that makes sense. It's me. Yeah, it is. So I guess a more rising popular trend is
supportive.
It's kind of becoming more popular, but it's been around for a little while, is kicking your case or not talking about your case at all in summary and just going for turns. And it kind of works sometimes. When the only time you should really be going for this is if you really have little to no chance of winning offense on your case and you have a valid turn on your opponent's case. At that point, you should just spend time on that turn. I personally don't recommend this, but if you're going to do it, make sure you have a turn that can win you the round and make sure you can weigh it and implicate it so that you can win the round. A lot of judges won't vote off of like kicking case and going for a turn. I feel like a lot more judges are comfortable voting off of case, but you obviously do have your judges that will vote off of this kind of stuff.
Okay, so if you do want to kick case, then there's a few things that you need to consider. So the first one is that make sure there's no turn ground on your case, because then you have to spend time like frontlining that, and also it's just inconvenient for you if you have to spend time on case for kicking it. So that's like normal impacts. Usually, like, I don't know, most people don't impact turn poverty, hopefully. So read things that aren't turnable, also on the link level. Then if you want to like do this on your own, you need to read very like long turns essentially. And I don't mean like long in terms of just like repeating a bunch of the same thing. It has to be long in the sense it's like kind of like a little baby contention, because as Sharan was saying earlier, like a lot of judges aren't really comfortable voting off of just turns because a lot of the time turns aren't developed well coming out of rebuttal, so they are lacking a lot of like parts of the argument, whether it be uniqueness, the link, internal link, or the honestly the impact. A lot of the time people don't terminalize turns, so then it's just like I don't understand why you're extending a turn if there's no impact coming off of it, or they don't extend like their opponent's impact if they're doing link turns. So definitely you need to like write good, well-warranted turns, so that's like probably at least like 30 to 40 seconds at the very least. And then as I mentioned before, if you're going to do this, you also really need to terminalize turns, because a lot of people will just be like, this is bad because like this happens in set, but they don't explain like what this happening does for the round, because you have to do like comparative analysis between like why the turn is like worse than their case. So if you want to do it, like you definitely have to make sure that you terminalize turns well, just because there's a lot higher standard for like these sort of turns, or sorry, this sort of like strategy in the second half of the round, because it's not developed starting from like the very beginning of the round.
I forgot one thing on this last slide. Another time you could probably use this is if your opponents have like 3 turns on each of your arguments and like a non-unique or something like that. Then at that point you just concede to the non-uniques instead of wasting time responding to all of your opponent's turns, and you would go for the turn you have on their case. But usually this isn't the case. So it's just another way or another scenario where you would think about using the strategy.
Okay, so in terms of like how you can improve summary, so this is like very similar to the intro to summary stuff, but like everyone needs to hear it again. So you should be mapping out or like practicing your sentences before a round or before a tournament, because a lot of the time people will just go up there and extend stuff from case that does not matter, and it's just like a waste of time that's very frustrating to watch. Then you should be writing out weighing. You should be at this like point, if you were like participating in higher level out rounds, you should be doing a lot of really good weighing. And a lot of the times this weighing is thought of before the round. So have a weighing doc, compare all of your impacts to other impacts. Like it should be like well written out analysis. Obviously don't read word for word. It should be something that comes to you naturally in a round. Then I think that beforehand, like it's kind of interesting to like map out a judge's ballot and like to think about different paths to the ballot for you, especially if you're reading a case that has multiple links or like you are reading like a kind of a unique case. Definitely think about how your case would kind of look like kind of on a judge's ballot and how they would want to vote. Obviously, you should be frontlining. You should be spending a lot of time doing this, because a lot of time front lines in round are just like, oh, well, my case says this. Like even in like high level out rounds that like are very good, but obviously like there's always more work to be done on doing adequate frontlining. The second thing is just doing redos. Like I think this is really helpful after the round because it's fresh in your mind, and also it kind of just like it's like muscle memory in some ways, just like reinforcing good habits. With redos, however, you need to be specific with your redos and like kind of pinpoint what you need to improve on. Like don't just do redos for the sake of doing redos, because that'll just drive you crazy. Like if you knew that like you didn't frontline that well, like focus really on like practicing frontlining when you're doing your redos. But overall, like obviously don't like overstretch yourself, because debate should be fun and like it shouldn't be driving you crazy. Okay, and then drills, like this is basically the same thing as the intro one, but if you missed it the first time, like I think my favorite drill to do is like the AF case, the neg rebuttal, and then the AF summary of 2 minutes, which is just frontlining and extending, and then the neg summary that should say like 45 seconds to a minute of extending defense. Also, another thing that's really great to do for summary is doing like condensation drills, because time management often is a problem for people in summary. So that's basically just like practice, like if you read a whole contention that is like 3 minutes, condensing that whole contention down to like 1 minute 30 seconds or less, but keeping the same like amount of content or the same argument is a really great drill to do, and it also helps with your word economy. And obviously drills where you just like frontline like rebuttals are really helpful. So I think that if you watch like the first half of a round and then you just practice frontlining the rebuttal, I think that's helpful. And also make sure that you're getting better at frontlining. But with that, make sure that when you're doing this sort of frontlining, you're actively thinking about what the frontline is and how it is interactive. Because if you don't, then it's kind of just pointless to do this and it reinforces bad habits. But I think that's all we have for our lecture today. So if you have questions, feel free to like Slack us if you're doing the Beyond Resolve workshop, or you can message us on Facebook or anything like that. Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.